So now that Sherman is into North Carolina, he's going to keep heading north. His plan is to join Grant at Petersburg, and Grant wants to combine their forces to fully surround Lee and be able to close in on him. By March of 1865, though, there are only about 35,000 Confederates left defending the city. They're low on food, they're low on ammunition, and other vital supplies. And Grant thinks if he can just break through without waiting for Sherman, then he can go ahead and get to Richmond by the time Sherman arrives, and he manages to do it on April 2nd. When he breaks through Petersburg, all of the Confederate military and leaders in Richmond know that he is going to be there any second, any day, and he's just going to, absolutely destroy them. So they pretty much flee the city, and so the Union invades Richmond the next day. Richmond falls very quickly. So Lee is left with very few men, really only about 13,000, and he decides that he's going to try to just abandon Richmond and try to join up with the with the Confederate troops that are in North Carolina fighting Sherman. So Lee tries to go and head to North Carolina, but Grant's army stops him and blocks their escape, and they surround him in the town of Appomattox Courthouse. So on Sunday, April 9th, Grant and Lee meet each other at a private home, the one in the photo. And there's a little bit of small talk there. Actually, Grant and Lee knew each other. They were old friends. They fought together in the Mexican-American War, and they knew each other from West Point. So, a little bit of how's your wife, how's your kids type of deal. And finally, Grant presents Lee with the terms of surrender, and all he asked was that his men turn over all their weapons before they go. And if you're wondering why he didn't ask for more or try to arrest anyone, it's because they both knew that this was the end of the road. They had fought a long and difficult war, and it was over now. And it didn't really matter who got arrested because they were all one country after this again, and it didn't really matter. So Lee agrees, and if you remember what Lee's been doing before this, Lee's been fighting at Richmond and Petersburg, and his men have been starving. They've been really, really lacking supplies. So actually, before Lee's men leave, Grant's army feeds Lee's, sort of a sign of good faith, showing that we're all one big happy family again. So they signed the papers, and now the war is officially over on April 9th of 1865. But we can't end on a happy note, right? We've got one more little piece here that's important to the war, which is going to be the death and assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So before the war, there was a secret society founded called the Knights of the Golden Circle, and John Wilkes Booth, who you should know as the man who assassinates Abraham Lincoln, John Wilkes Booth was initiated into the Knights of the Golden Circle in late 1860, and when the war got going, they came up with a plan to kidnap the president and try to hold him for ransom in exchange for recognizing Southern independence and ending the war. But this takes a really long time to plan. You can't just throw a bag over Lincoln's head and run away with him. Kidnapping the president is a big deal. So they work on planning this out, for a really long time, but unfortunately they're not able to make it happen before the war is over. And so when Lee surrenders to Grant, now they're thinking, what should we do? So on April 11th, Lincoln gave a speech outside the White House about how, pretty much announcing that the war was over. It was only 2 days after the surrender at Appomattox. And he was talking about, we're going to start stitching ourselves back together again. We've just torn the country apart, and it's time to begin to reconstruct. It's time to heal. And he talked about how freedmen, African Americans, were going to play a major role in that. And he's working on the 13th Amendment, and he's going to keep working on other, legislation and laws and bills that will further enfranchise the former slave population in the South. And this pushed Booth over the edge. Booth was in the audience when Lincoln gave the speech, and he was just, from that point, the plan goes from kidnap Lincoln to assassinate Lincoln. So there's actually a lot of reports that Lincoln supposedly foresaw his assassination. He told his bodyguard before he left the night of his assassination that he had had dreams of his assassination the last 3 nights. So when he left for the theater, his bodyguard, William H. Crook, was like, no, don't go. I don't think it's a good idea if you're having these dreams. And Lincoln was like, no, it'll be fine. And when he left, he told him goodbye. Instead, when every other night when he had left, he had told William Crook good night. So on the night of April 14th of 1865, Lincoln attended a showing of a play called Our American Cousin at the Ford Theater in Washington, D.C. And shortly after 10 o'clock, John Wilkes Booth entered the president's box and shot Lincoln at point-blank range. Lincoln was taken across the street to a doctor, but he died around 7:30 the next morning. And we had to swear in our vice president. Now, Lincoln wasn't the only target that night. He was not the only person who was supposed to be assassinated. Obviously, they knew that when Lincoln was assassinated, who would become president? The vice president. Then if he's assassinated, who becomes president? The Speaker of the House. Then if he's assassinated, who becomes president? The Secretary of State. And the list just goes on and on and on. So the Knights of the Golden Circle actually had arrangements to kill almost all of these people who were going to be sort of in line for the presidency until they got to someone they liked. So the Secretary of State, William Seward, was supposed to be assassinated that night by a guy named Lewis Powell. Lewis Powell's assassination attempt did not go as smoothly as John Wilkes Booth. Powell broke into Seward's home and managed to it was really dark, and he managed to finally find Seward's bedroom, and when he gets in, he gets up to his bed and he fires his weapon, but it misfired. It jams, and he's freaked out, and he just starts hitting him in the head with his gun, and then he takes out a sword and starts stabbing him, but he can't really see anything, and it's dark, so Lewis Powell freaks out, and he just leaves and runs away. By a miracle, William Seward was okay. Reportedly, his daughter walked in and saw him, all bloody there, and was like, "Someone call the police. My father's been murdered." And William Seward sat up and said, "Don't call the police. Call a doctor. I'm okay." So he managed to somehow not anything vital was stabbed. A total miracle. Andrew Johnson, the vice president, was also supposed to be killed that night by a guy named George Atzerodt. Atzerodt was waiting at the hotel where Andrew Johnson was staying, and he was, nervous about trying to kill the vice president of the United States, so he sat down at the hotel bar and had a drink, and then another drink, and another drink, and another drink, and it wasn't long until he was absolutely blackout drunk, and he just got, too drunk, and he chickened out, and Andrew Johnson escaped his assassination attempt and was sworn in as our 17th president. On April 26th, Booth was found at a farm he had been hiding out in. Soldiers found him in a barn. They set fire to the barn to try to smoke him out, and then they started just shooting into the barn, hoping that they would hit him, and they do. They hit him in the back of the head, which is only about an inch below where Lincoln was shot, actually, and it ends up severing his spinal cord. And when they carry him out of the barn, right before he dies, he utters his last words, which were useless. Useless. He says it twice. We don't know what he meant. He could have been talking about, himself or this entire situation, Lincoln. He could have been talking about anything, but those were John Wilkes Booth's last words. So in the end, the Union suffered 359,528 dead and 275,175 wounded. You don't need to write those numbers down. The Confederacy had about 250. We're not as sure about those numbers. The Confederacy suffered about 258,000 dead and about 100,000 wounded. So overall, over 700,000 men, almost 800,000 are included in the total of casualties for the war, which is incredible. And really the main reason for that is actually the disease, which I've mentioned before. The World War I actually had a larger number of casualties from combat, but if you include all the number of casualties from both sides of the Civil War, if you combine every other war, their number of casualties, the Civil War exceeds them all. So an extremely bloody and difficult war. And our country really, while it might be together after the Civil War, is still extremely divided. And that's what we'll get into in our next unit.